Welcome back to Things Hidden, our podcast where we explore and analyze current events as well as anthropology, and we let them come together in a very interesting and dynamic way. Today, I want to talk to you I've been doing an ongoing monologue series, answering questions about some of the fundamental terms that I've used on my program. And there's lots of kind of unique terms that we've coined. One of the terms that I've talked a lot about is what I call Christ hauntedness. So we're going to talk about that today. What is Christ hauntedness? I've mentioned this concept a lot through the years. We talk about on this show that America is a Christ haunted nation, that our society is Christ haunted. We talk about the West being Christ haunted. We talk about the world being Christ haunted. What does that mean? Okay. Well, you have to understand this, of course, from the anthropological foundation that we have established thus far on this program. And if you're new to it, then you might have to go back and watch some of the other foundational episodes to kind of pick up. But for those who've been following along, you're familiar with some of the anthropological work that we do. That if you don't have a theology, if you only have a theology of Christianity, if you only have a theology of the Bible, you don't have a full picture of the Bible. Jesus mentions that he's the Son of Man. As much as he mentions that he's the Son of God, he also mentions that he's the Son of Man. And the Son of God is actually a title that is not quite as, let's say, unique as Son of Man. Son of Man being the title for the Messiah. There's many different people that we could be called sons of God in the time that of the literature that's being written in Jesus' time. But Jesus is both Son of God in the singular sense and also Son of Man in the singular sense, which means he gives us the fullest picture of the theological as well as the truest and fullest picture of the anthropological, which is who are we, where are we coming, where did we come from, why do we do the things that we do, why do we have the conflict patterns that we do, why do we have the peace patterns that we do, why do we have laws and rituals and prohibitions and taboos in the same way. So Christ haunted, this notion of Christ hauntedness is something that I stress a lot. And that is this notion that ever since Jesus came into history and upended the expectations of how to create order, which is through a controlled act of violence against a singular victim or a group of people who cannot have enough social currency to create vengeance. Okay, if you want to have catharsis, which is release from tension, relief from conflict and bad blood, then society stumbled upon the scapegoat mechanism or the generative mechanism of violence. This is how you generate order. This is how you create meaning. This is how you create peace. And they would select someone who is arbitrarily different than the rest of the community, some that stood out in a sea of sameness when people were imitating each other to the point where they're losing their sense of self, they're losing their sense of boundaries and distinctions. And in that kind of environment, negative mimetic violence is very easily continued and swept away into the whole society. It sweeps everything up, consumes everything, devours everything. And so it's easy for society to just be destroyed at that point, but societies unconsciously stumble on a scapegoat mechanism to discharge bad blood in an imitative fashion towards a common direction. If everybody's finger pointing at everybody else, they're imitating each other, but you can also imitate each other in the same singular direction and say, we find common ground with each other based in our mutual hatred and fear and outrage at the person who seems to be really the bane of all of our existence. And so on the cross, when Jesus comes into history, in his life, he's preparing society he gives you a picture of where history is going to go with the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are all these different things. These are pictures of where history is going to move because of what he's about to do. And It's also, he spends a lot of time talking about the nonviolent ethic of turning of the cheek, which is consistent with everything he does in his lifestyle, which is basically saying, when I dissolve the scapegoat mechanism, when I expose it and reveal the trick that you guys have been using to create your own sense of meaning and your own gods, when when the real God of the universe shows up and walks into our God making machine called sacrifice and reveals it for what it really is, which is not something from gods, but rather something from man, something from the crowd. When God walks into our myth making, our history making, our order making machine, he breaks it from within and exposes it. And so you can't go back to scapegoating and sacrifice to create meaning. You can't go back there again. It doesn't work. Once it's been seen, humanity, even though it doesn't fully grasp it, is infected by that visual and what they saw and what they experienced in hearing the story of the Bible and seeing the pictures even of the passion and life of Christ. So everything you see with the ethics of Christ, do not resist evil with violence. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. When someone takes your outer garment, give them your inner garment too. All of these things are about nonviolent, mimetic disengagements with escalating violence. And the reason why he gives you those things before he goes to the cross is because he's outlining the kingdom of heaven ethics that humans are going to have to learn to live by in order to survive once he has destroyed their up to this point way of creating order and peace, sacrifice. So once he destroys sacrificial violence by exposing it nonviolently, it will lose its efficacy evermore. It will increasingly lose its efficacy. It will increasingly lose its its ordering ability the longer we continue in history in the effect of the cross. And so he gives us those kingdom of heaven ethics, not as some pie in the sky, like, wouldn't it be nice if we all did this? No, but rather a literal kind of street guide to how to live in a good way, in a great way, in a society that is deprived of the bumpers of sacrifice. The bumpers being, if you're playing bowling, you have bumpers for kids, right? Because, they need a little help to get the game going. When you have sacrifice dissolved from within the way the cross does, those bumpers are now removed, and you've got to learn how to bowl. You've got to learn how to make the strike, right? Because otherwise you can go off into the gutter and hit nothing and your society falls apart. So that's so important to understand that you're dissolving the crutches. You can use that word. That sacrificial violence is a crutch that society used to lean on to develop itself. Another word you could use is placenta, that with society, humanity, that's what Girard calls religion, is the placenta of mankind, is that it nurtures it, develops it, but it has to get out of it. And that's what Jesus is doing on the cross. The ethics of Christ that he models through visual images, like do not resist evil with violence, turn the other cheek, those who live by the sword die by the sword. All these different visuals are designed to help you understand these are how you're going to survive as a human species once your fake lie of what God is and what justice requires is exposed from within. You're going to have to make the choice increasingly to choose the path that is modeled by turning of the cheek. Okay? That this is a way of dismantling violence by allowing violence to fall on its own weight rather than to revivify violence by having endless tit for tat aggression. Okay? And so turning of the cheek is not an escape from society. I want this to be clear. Turning of the cheek is the very foundational mechanism by which society can flourish after the cross. It is the ultimate, turning of the cheek is represented on the cross, And of course, that world order ethic is now increasingly required to function in everyday life, not just for actual violence, but violence in the sense of social violence, disarray, social conflict, strife, all of those things. All of these things are increasingly going to require increased practicing of the turning of the cheek method of solving conflict. Because we continually lose more and more of our ability to find discharging of our bad blood onto common enemies, we increasingly have to rely on turning of the cheek practices in order to break out of scandal and out of conflict and jealousies and envies and rivalries and fighting and so forth. Does that make sense? I want to make sure you are seeing this. As we move further and further away from the event of the cross, the infection of the cross's ability, the infection, because the kingdom of heaven will spread like yeast in a loaf. So it's not an unchristian thing for me to call it an infection when we're talking about the yeast as a metaphor, when we're talking about this spreading in a loaf. That the gospel is that the cross is like an inoculation in history, that then we, not through an ideological submission, but rather free will coming along, stumbling in the dark, and slowly but surely ever so conforming our species to the way of the cross, in fits and starts, in good times and in falling back into worse retreats against the cross, are moving towards that direction in history. And humanity always comes up with more elaborate, violent returns, kind of a thunderclap return of violence that has to always happen in the name of victims, ever so carefully disguised and ever so fragile victim language and garb. Okay. So the more we go away from the further we continue with the Christian infection in society, the more the requirement for turning of the cheek ethics has to be followed in order to have any kind of stability. So it's almost like you have a choice about how you're going to act in the micro scale, but humanity as a whole really doesn't have a choice because the trajectory is continuing. We're more gospel infected than ever. And that's what I mean by Christ haunted. Being Christ haunted means being ever more aware of the way in which we have had order and continue to try to make order by discharging our sins onto the back of somebody else, by discharging our annoyances onto the back of somebody else or some other group. And that slow process of becoming ever so aware of how we do that comes with it an ever increasing urgent need to practice more and more the turning of the cheek approach to resolving problems and conflict, because we will get less and less of our bad blood resolved the more this continues. So if we go back to the 1920s, I'm just picking a random decade, compared to the 2020s that we're in now, we are more aware of the way in which we participate in scapegoating than we were relative to the average person in the 1920s. It doesn't mean that we're morally superior, but rather that history has had that much more time for theosis to take place in the Homo sapiens species itself. Because history and reality itself, I believe, is experiencing a kind of theosis along history as it continues in redemptive history. So 1920s, they were still, in America. I'm talking about mostly, all of this has an effect on the whole world, but I'm particularly talking about the locus of where world global culture has been shaped for some time, has been in the West. And to a large part of the last century and this century, it's still been dominated by America's culture with all of the different intersections that it has around the world because of Hollywood and music and social media and the impact of our entertainment culture on the world for good and bad. So when you look at the 1920s, people would go to church and then get whipped up into a mob. Not everybody. I understand this was not something everybody was doing, but this was still a thing that would happen. You know, people could get whipped up in a mob right after church the next day and go to participate in an actual lynch mob and, you know, hang someone, burn someone, and take a piece of their thumb as a relic from what they experienced. This in 2024 America does not happen in this way. Thanks be to God, right? But the lynch mob continues against the baby, right? In a collective voting, we all collectively vote and keep, you know, unborn children as second-class citizens, to say the least. This lynch mob continues to happen in all kinds of sterile, bureaucratically enforced acts of coercion in the form of rigged regulations, in the form of attacks against people's values and sense of safe, trying to radicalize people's sense of identity using coercive methods, throwing people into explosive conflicts together, wars, right? Proxy wars, funding of wars, bombing campaigns, incarceration, threats of that for nonviolent acts, trying to dissolve free speech. Right now, they're trying to dissolve free speech in America, and they're getting it on the left and the right are both being normalized in the idea of loosening their commitment to free speech. All of this is an attack on the human person. It's trying to roll back what the gospel has shown, but any attempt to roll back will be Christ haunted, meaning it will have to be garbed with an image that looks like it's outflanking the current norm of protection of victims. Okay. And so in so doing that, any type of an attempt to roll back Christ concern for victims and individuals and resisting scapegoating violence, any attempt to roll that back will have to be done so in a way that is presented rhetorically as being more concerned with victims. But in so doing that, it will sow its own demise because its concern for victims will itself dissolve its own violence because people will be able to see the truth of it. So, you know, for example, look at the thing with the January 6th thing, right? So many people locked up for decades, right? For participating in what is now apparently, you know, we know which authorities we're seeing more and more people were involved from the state at seemingly so many different levels of that whole event. And that, you know, the person who was supposed to be triggering this mob was calling for National Guard to be, you know, there at the Capitol building to prevent something that he was supposed to be doing. I mean, it's just so stupid. And it's gotten to the point where he's now being tried with criminal charges for something that I can't even fathom how farcical we've become in this current establishment system, where somebody can be tried for an insurrection that they themselves were trying to prevent by literally calling up the National Guard to like make sure nothing violent happened. I can't imagine how we got to that point, but that's how farcical and ridiculous and absurd the attempt for the establishment to keep its scapegoat mechanism going. And they have to do so by trying to position their raw use of sacrificial violence against Trump supporters and against, Trump through the prosecution of him. They have to always dress it up as this isn't a threat on democracy, which means what? They're trying to emotionally say, they're trying to hit you at your emotional level and say, this is an attack on you if these people are not scapegoated. This is an attack on your freedom to be a woman, your freedom to be transgender, your freedom to be whatever, right? They're trying to make you feel like what they're doing is not sacrificial violence to discharge blame and shame and hatred onto a select group of people or a person, but rather it's just self-defense from their prior violence, right? It's always got to be that. So you can barely even get so much violence out of people that they have to concoct and trigger by throwing flash bombs into the crowd to incite the violence into a violent degree to the way it was. with people getting pushing and shoving and kicking and coming into the building. And then they're being chaperoned. And we have video of people, of police, unshackling somebody and doing a fist bump for a supposed guy that was arrested. And they're like fist bumping like they know each other. And, there's videos of very polite tours happening, videos of all kinds of undercover agents for this group and that group and this group. And, of course, they're given these plea deals, which is so this is an apocalyptic revelation for the conservative America, who thinks still that everybody who gets arrested by local police or whatever, drug charges, lock them up, throw them away. Well, they're using the same conspiracy charge and the same plea bargaining deal that they've used to predate on people all the time. They're now using all those mechanisms to target a political group that has, tens of millions of supporters. And so it's going to backfire, right? Because now you're opening up that group's mind to the idea that law and order is not what they thought it was, that it's a lot of hokey nonsense, sacrificial violence, trickeries and lies and accusatory machinery going on. That's not necessary for order. And at the same time, the left, they try to turn their moral conscience off and say, destroy those Trump supporters, lock them up for decades, lock away Trump, take away his Secret Service, which is, they're literally saying in their little fantasy that they don't want him to live. They want him to die. If you're saying literally pass a bill to deprive a president of Secret Service protection when he's in prison, you're saying you want him to die. You want him to be murdered, right? That's what you're literally saying. And they've got people in the bill trying to pass bills like this in Congress. They're hiding the quiet part, out loud. They can't hide it. It's got to come out. And it won't solve their need for catharsis, because we're so Christ haunted that half the country doesn't go along, where more than half of the country won't go along in saying, yeah, this is a legit thing to do. And if half the country or more doesn't go along with it, doesn't even have to be half, it could be less than half. But when you're talking 50+% of the country not going along with a scapegoat mob, it ruins the effect. It's akin to going into a movie, trying to watch a movie, and you're trying to get into the, let's say it's an adventure or action movie. And right at these pivotal moments, someone keeps turning on the lights and saying, that's fake. That monster is fake. That's a computer graphic, guys. Now, how would the audience feel? They would get so mad. They would start yelling, right? And so that's what's happening when Trump supporters and people who are more independent, such as myself, who don't go along with their hate witch mob and say, yeah, get rid of them. They're an attack on democracy. Yes, he wanted to have an insurrection while he's calling up the National Guard and getting denied. It's such a total, complete inside job hoax. It's obvious to any thinking critical person. And so it doesn't take much brain power or moral conscience to see that, right? And so you can only double down in a kind of stupor so long where it's getting, someone's turning on the lights like what I'm doing right now, and many others are doing it, whether they like them or not, that the individual that they hate, they're not going along with the hive mind. And so it's ruining the cathartic experience, because you can't suspend disbelief and get excited about the monster being overthrown and thrown off the cliff when someone's turning on the lights and say, that's fake. That can't happen like that. That's not believable. You ever have someone do that when you're watching a movie and say, that's not realistic? You're like, come on, I don't want to look at all the flaws of the design of the movie or the script or the storyline. I don't want to look at that. I want to forget about all that and just go along for the ride. That's the whole magic of false religion. That's the whole magic behind sacrificial religion and sacrifice itself. You have to go along for the ride. You have to be mimetically swept up and transcended out of your personal conscience and kind of go along with it. And so that's critical for its effect. And because people don't go along with it in unanimity, it breaks down in its ability to provide the solution that people feel it might still provide a little bit of. And so, and if you say, well, the people still have a violent appetite, I guarantee you that the left would recoil if Trump were to be literally publicly flogged. Would they go along with that? There's some people on the left that would, right? There's some progressives that would say, okay, yeah, publicly lash him in public. and televise it on CNN Live. But there would be a lot of people who hate Trump who would viscerally recoil at that. So tell me, sir, or ma'am, whoever's watching, if we haven't changed in society. That yes, there's all this anger and aggression and mimetic desire to defeat and conquer and destroy, but even in its visceral nastiness, and yes, it can still spill out in, as we see, street fights and brutality and killings that still happen on video and put all over social media, but they cause way more scandal now today than they would in previous times. And people who hate Trump would not want to see him. I mean, do you think that the whatever millions, how many millions of people hate Trump in America? Was it 55 million, 60 million, whatever, 70 million, 80 million, whatever? Do you think all 60 million would want to see him, if he was convicted of all of his crimes, to be publicly executed or to have a public crucifixion of Trump? Would they want to go through that? Why not? What has changed but the cross and its effect infecting more and more and more, hundreds of years after it, thousands of years after it, another 1,000 years after it, all of that still infecting the culture about how we should treat one another, how we should deal with guilt, how we should deal with sin, our personal responsibility with shame, our personal responsibility to our neighbor, our personal responsibility to collective violence, our personal responsibility to ritual, all of those different things, how law should look, how punishment should look, how empathy for the way we treat people who we have power over should look, right? All those things have been worked out under the shadow of the cross for so long. That's why we call it Christ hauntedness. So the left can't fully stomach going back the way people would handle their enemies even 80 years ago in the West, maybe 90 years ago, 100 years ago, 200, 300 years, 400 years. They couldn't do to Trump what England did to William Wallace. They couldn't do it. They couldn't go through it. They don't hate him enough. That's an effect of the cross. Okay? So I want to explain something that helps us see the Christ hauntedness and how it works. What we call traditionalists or conservatives, you have Christ, right? Let's say Christ and his movement, his what I call the personhood revolution of history that he has inaugurated. And it's an effect on our societies and our cultures and our perception of the world. That Christ hauntedness has a kind of pace that's going in history. God is moving history forward, and the person of Jesus is the human embodiment of where history will actually look. History will look more and more like Jesus as this project, as Jesus saves the day and saves the world. So when you look at that, when you see that, you can understand that when you look at imitating Jesus, the traditionalist or right-wing approach to trying to imitate Jesus is to say, I'm not going to dare to walk on the same level of the radicalness of what Christ is doing in this ethical way. I'm going to walk a few steps lower than Christ because I'm very pious and loyal and very honorable, right? That's the traditionalist right-wing move in its error in imitating Jesus. Jesus is radical. We're not going to be that radical. I encounter this all the time as someone who understands do not resist evil with violence. God desires mercy, not sacrifice, and how it's a social ordering principle of how to solve and discharge conflict in an orderly way after the effect of the cross in history. As someone who understands that, I can encounter this conservative right-wing response of, well, we're not supposed to imitate Jesus when it comes to politics. We need a Caesar. We need a this. We need a king. We need a FDR. You know, they're still crying for some of that stuff, right? And so that's the conservative right-wing approach to emulating Jesus, is to say, well, he's Jesus. He's radical in his forgiveness. I'm going to walk a few steps behind. I couldn't dare approach him. That's the same mistake that the disciples made with Jesus. Like Peter, remember when he said, let me wash your feet or whatever. And Peter says, oh, no, you can't do that, And so this kind of piety, I'm too pious to truly follow the radicalness of Christ, right? It's almost like conservatives are afraid that they'll be considered not religious enough, not holy enough, if they really try to step into the radicalness of the model of Jesus in our lives, when it comes to wars, when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to funding horrific wars, when it comes to debasing people's purchasing power with unjust weights and measures with money, when it comes to telling the truth about the toxic food and drugs, the cartel of our healthcare system, when it comes to telling the truth of what we're doing to one another and our families, what we're doing to our kids with our garbage school system, all these different ways in which the sick system we have that's being it's breaking down under the weight of its own contradictions. Conservative, reactionary, traditionalist responses to the radical move of Christ is to say, I'm going to walk a few steps slower than that. Okay, that'll make me look holy and pious. I wouldn't want to be seen getting out of the boat and walking on water. What do you think I am, Jesus? How dare you? That the traditionalist radical, the traditional right-wing reactionary approach to the Christ, when they even want to try to be ostensibly Christian still, would be to say, walk on water like Christ? Who do you think you are, Jesus? Actually, no, I'm just reading what Jesus said for us to do, right? So in that same way, they missed that boat. They missed the point of imitating Jesus. Well, I don't want to go too far in imitating Jesus. He's Jesus. I'm just a lowly, pious, self-critical, very religious, pious, holy person. Who would I to ever try to be as radical and forgiving as that? We still need a king, and we need an emperor. We need a radical, vicious. We need to treat the left very viciously and destroy them and throw communist people off helicopters. And then we'll be Christian afterwards, because that's what. No, it's like, no, you're actually just, again, worshiping yourself, and that's your excuse for not living up to the beautiful radical standard of Christ. Now, the left, their error in the Christ haunted situation we're in is they like to try to act like they're running faster than Christ in history, right? So the traditionalist move is, I'm going to keep a little, Jesus is walking here in history, I'm going to walk over here behind him, okay? And then they miss out, and they're back the blue, and until all their guys were in prison with decades for a government engineered insurrection and so forth. And, oh yeah, this guy, he'll win, he'll save us, and oh man, everything's worse. And he's going along with destroying our currency and destroying our immune system with garbage drugs and all this other nonsense that he's been a part of. And they're always trying to, don't go so far, don't be so morally aware like Christ is. Who are you? You're not Christ. That's their move. The left-wing move is to say, well, here's Christ walking. Oh, we're over here. We're running over here. We're past him already. We're already down the road. Oh, man, he can't keep up. He's outdated. He's a relic. He's a tool of colonialism or whatever nonsense they heard from some, rich, professor. So the left-wing move is to try to rivalrously imitate Jesus, say, no, we're way more radical than whatever that individual is up to with Jesus' story. That's not nearly where we need to be. It's not fast enough for where we need to be. Okay, but both of them are haunted by and anchored by what Christ reveals on the cross. And that's why society is having this turbulence. And that's why it doesn't know what to do, because it will continue to see in different ways how much corruption and injustice is behind so many of the systems. Now, you might say to yourself, because you might have been hearing from religious folks, but David, why are you talking about being aware? You're talking about we're haunted by the cross. We're Christ haunted. Okay. But why is the haunting that you're depicting, why is it always so anchored in things like justice, corruption, violence, treatment of the poor, treatment of the outcast, misfit? Because you know why? The entire Bible is all about that. Did you know that? Every time a prophet is talking, he's talking about justice, the way you treat the poor, your corrupt wars, violence, unjust weights and measures, right? So these are not little little pet projects that Jesus is interested in, but it's kind of a side thing. It's kind of the entire point of whenever God is sending a godly man into history in the story of the Bible, the anthology of the books there, is kind of the point of every single story, is dealing with even Jesus' own mother, Mary. When she's announcing that her son is coming, she's jumping with joy. She's excited and she sings this song, and it's talking about justice against corruption. So don't let the religious pious folks that always want to walk 40 steps behind Jesus to show that they're really holy and good followers of Christ, so they can also vote for their Caesars and their kings and their brutality. Don't let them fool you here. That's a losing strategy. And don't let the progressives fool you. They're trying to, oh, we got something more radical. And therefore, we can go ahead and provide all these radical, violent, retributive models of justice called social justice. Social, because it denies the human person, is guilty of the sin of scapegoating and sacrificial violence and shame shifting. And so that's why they have to put a caveat to their term of justice, social justice, right? And it's just like with the Gaza versus the Gazan conflict with Israel, right? It's always mediated between groups. You're supposed to hate that group or that group. You can't just say, no, human persons are sacred, period. You know, so they have to, the establishment is always going to try to police the terms of people's fevered haunting of being aware of persecution, like Paul was on the road to Damascus. They're always going to have this kind of redirection attempt. So the left is pretty good at exposing the war crimes of what's going on, killing so many children in Gaza. But what happens? It gets redirected into this rhetoric of, well, the reason why it's bad is because it's an act of neocolonialism or it's an act of whiteness or something, right? So what does that do? That sets up the narrative for it's okay to allow for vicious, heinous violence against people who are in the camp of neocolonialism or whiteness. You see how so that revivifies Satan casting out Satan. But again, all of these things will continue to create more and more schism, because even the left can't unite around that, because people feel like, wait a second, that's not the way you guys are going. You're ending up persecuting and supporting persecution in a different way. Why can't we just ground this in the human person? Nobody wants to do that because that's the hardest thing to do. That's what the cross was about. People say this, that one of the unique things about the Christian picture of life after death, of course, it's not just life after death, as N.T. Wright would say it, it's life after death. But one of the interesting things about the Christian picture of what that looks like is that we still retain our personhood in the new kingdom, the new heaven and earth. In our resurrected state, we're going to maintain our sense of individual personhood. So that gives you a picture as to what's important in God's eyes, that we understand that violence, we have a personal responsibility for it, not a personal responsibility because of some ideological thing that we're a part of called the West, or some ideological commitment because of our skin tone, like we're a member of a union called whiteness or blackness, and that's our participation in. No, that's not what it looks like in heaven. In heaven, there isn't one Borg of people called black, one Borg of people called white. No, it's human persons are judged, and human persons exist in the new heaven and the new earth. Okay? It's not like little unions are redeemed as like little metaborg entities, right? It's human persons judged. You have to give an account for what you did, not I'm giving an account for what my ancestor did or other people that have my similar skin tone or gender or whatever, right? It's you. What did you do? So that's the focus of history in the Christian sense, is on the human person. In its relationship with the community is so intertwined. Yes, absolutely. But that's where a lot of the errors persist in our judgments, right? Is that we're always saying, well, it's those darn blanks or those darn blanks, right? It's the men, it's the women, it's the feminists, it's the communists, it's the fascists, it's whatever, right? group, because that allows us to try to self-justify and get off the hot seat of what it reveals about our own hearts and what it reveals about what God thinks about human persons. He doesn't want this person to be tortured or killed because they're in a country run by so-called neocolonialists, and he doesn't want this person to be killed because they're run by a group of people who are called terrorists. He doesn't want people, human persons, killed. And he doesn't want people being justified as collateral damage. So this is something that has to go away, and the meek shall inherit the earth. And until we understand that, we will be haunted in our conscience ever so much. Until we understand that, the containers of our differences will continue to be frazzled, and we'll continue to fight over every concept of what is different. Like gender is a difference that's completely not contained anymore. So people are fighting over that. Ethnos was a container of this is a group of Italians, this is a group of Polish, this is a group of that. Now all those things are being dissolved, and then the same thing with people trying to create containers of difference with race. Those things now become conflict spots more than before, because all those things, when you don't have a scapegoat mechanism to create meaning and order and differentiation, when you don't have that, you're left to endless rivalries and tit for tat reciprocity of insults, blames, and so forth. But the reciprocity of blaming is all mediated by this haunting that, no, you're the one who's trying to crucify the martyrs. You're the one. Your gender is the one who is more guilty of trying to crucify Christ. No, your gender is. No, your country is. No, your ideology is. That's a Christ-haunted state of society. It's a state of culture. And there's a lot more than that, but we'll leave it there in the broad sense of what Christ-hauntedness means. I hope that helps. You can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. If you have any comments or feedback or questions, guest suggestions, hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.